Welcome. Thanks for coming out on this dark and stormy night. Umbrellas down, cell phones down. I'm David Levi Strauss, the chair of the MFA program in art criticism and writing here at SVA. I wanted to tell you about a few things we have coming up. Next month, we begin our new series, the spring series, in the brand spanking new Visual Arts Theater with Susan Buck Morris on Visual Empire, Thursday, January 29th. Poet and critic John Yao on common motifs in the work of Jasper Johns, Catherine Murphy, and Tom Noskowski, February 12th. Mick Tausig on drawings in anthropological fieldwork notebooks in the sanctity of the image, Thursday, March 5th. And Avital Ronell, Nietzsche Loves You, Tuesday, April 7th. W.J.T. Mitchell is a well-known figure in the fields of visual culture and iconology, particularly for his work on the relations of visual and verbal representations in the context of social and political issues. He's a professor of English and art history at the University of Chicago and the editor of the journal Critical Inquiry, and the author of a number of books published by the University of Chicago Press, including Iconology, Picture Theory, Landscape and Power, and What Do Pictures Want? The Lives and Loves of Images. Tonight he'll discuss the work of contemporary French philosopher Jacques Rancière, author of The Future of the Image. Please welcome W.J.T. Mitchell.
Well, I want to thank Una Kwok, who has been organizing all this for months, it seems like, and Levi Strauss, who issued me this invitation about a year ago. This is a curious paper, not like the usual kind of thing I would write. It was written for an occasion about 9 months ago. Jacques Rancière and I were invited to come to Columbia University to engage in a kind of tennis match, dialogue, debate, in which we would comment on each other's work, compare and contrast, and the particular focus was to be the topic of the future of the image, however you might take that phrase. So this paper is about more than Rancière. It's really about a kind of emergent field of reflection, philosophical, theoretical reflection on the nature of images, both their pasts and their futures, not just technical futures, but what you might call functional futures, the way images change their meaning, depending on their historical situation. For those of you who don't know Rancière's work and were coming here with the idea of getting an introduction, let me give you a 30-second introduction to the speaker who's not here. Rancière was part of the generation of '68, as I was too, although he was in Paris and I was, I think, in Columbus, Ohio. He was a student of Althusser and broke with Althusser in '68, as did many young intellectuals in his generation, over the question of whether the '68 revolution was to be managed and administered by the Communist Party or by the youth movement that was emerging, the New Left. He then went on to write a number of really powerful texts in political philosophy and the theory of education as well, among them a book called The Ignorant Schoolmaster, which is a kind of odd biographical narrative of a forgotten figure in the French 19th century who who followed Rousseau's principles, the idea being that the best schoolmaster is the one who starts from ignorance and leads students to find out what they need to teach themselves rather than trying to pump them full of his own knowledge. He's also written about poverty and about workers, about the French working classes and their aesthetic tastes in the 19th century. The assumption of sociologists like Pierre Bourdieu was that taste basically follows from class position, so workers basically have no taste or they have bad taste. And Rancière set out to disprove this by examining the correspondence and the journals of French workers in the 19th century who turned out to be very high-toned aesthetes underneath their dirty overalls. He's written about philosophy and its relation to the question of poverty, not the poverty of philosophy, but in a book called The Philosopher and His Poor. He asks the question, why does every philosopher have to have a shoemaker somewhere in the story? But in the latter part of his career, the last few years, he's turned to art and aesthetics and the question of the image. And this is where our work began to converge, particularly in two books, the Politics of Aesthetics, which I'll mention a bit, and more recently, The Future of the Image, which will be at least part of what I talk about. The title, The Future of the Image, is a very bad translation of his French text, which would probably be more adequately translated as The Destiny of the Image. And as if he was conscious of this mistranslation, Rancière opened his book by declining to provide any account of the future of the image. Instead, he said, I'm not going to give you a panoramic survey or what he called an odyssey, which would take us from the Aurorian glory of Lascaux's paintings to the contemporary twilight of a reality devoured by media images and an art doomed to monitors and synthetic images, unquote. Instead, he offered reflections on what he calls the labor of art, on the images that, in his view, provide it with its raw materials. So the non-artistic image, the pre-artistic image, is for Rancière a relatively simple and perhaps unproblematic thing. He says it is what will suffice as a substitute, what will stand in for whatever it represents. Well, so when I was pondering how to address this topic and this book, I decided to take the path that Rancière declines to take and trace the odyssey of the image from the cavernous gloom of Lascaux to the contemporary twilight of synthetic images. And for the sake of consistency in subject matter, I'm going to follow this as an animal trail, which begins with the familiar bisons and horses of Lascaux, and ends with a futuristic image of a futuristic animal, a digital dinosaur from the film Jurassic Park. Now, you might want to ask, why should we treat the long journey of the image from the deep past to the contemporary moment of virtual imaginary futures? Why should this be exemplified not by the image of man or woman, the human, who fabricates and beholds his image? Why should it be the image of the animal that would be the key to both the future of the image and the past, and this panoramic odyssey that I want to lay out for you? What is it about animal images that provide a clue to the entire odyssey of the image and allow us to glimpse the future of the image? Well, before I take that question on directly, I want to consider the situations of these two images themselves. Among the many speculations about the function of the Lascaux images is the notion that they were something like a ritualistic teaching machine in which a Platonic cinema was being staged prior to the hunt in order to familiarize the hunters with their prey, producing a virtual rehearsal that would, by a kind of homeopathic magic, ensure the success of the hunt. No doubt the smoky atmosphere and the ingestion of appropriate stimulants would help to heighten the dreamlike atmosphere of the cave, which becomes a place for using images to project and control an immediate and highly probable future. Similarly, the scene in Jurassic Park is in a dark room. It's in the control room of the park, which has just been invaded by an actual, not an imaginary, velociraptor that has accidentally turned on the film projector showing the park's orientation film. The raptor is caught in the projector beam in the movie projector beam at the moment when the film is showing the DNA sequence that made it possible to clone a real live dinosaur from its fossil remains. So if we imagined a real bison galloping into the caves of Lascaux and trampling the hunters, we would have a Paleolithic version of the effect produced in the projection room of Jurassic Park. So think of these two images then as an allegory of the beginning and the end of the odyssey of the image. They exemplify many of our common assumptions about the past and future of this narrative, moving from hand-painted primitive likenesses that still suffice to stand in for the objects they represent. I mean, there's nothing unintelligible about these images, no matter how deep into the past they go. We recognize what they are of, if not what they were doing. So that, on the one hand, to on the other, a highly technical object, a product of high-speed computing and genetic engineering in the fiction of Jurassic Park, that is then represented filmically by the latest development in the cinematic image, namely digital animation. Many more contrasts, and you probably, some of you who are film people will know that digital animation really got its big start with Jurassic Park, that Spielberg pioneered the transformation of animation from animatronics and robotics into digital animation. Many more contrasts could be elaborated between these images. The image of primitive magic versus the techno-scientific artifact, the mythic ritual of the deep past and the science fiction narrative of a possible future, the beast to be pursued in the wild, and the cloned organism to be produced as a theme park attraction. And yet the longer we contemplate the two images, the more evident it becomes that the binary oppositions between past and future, nature and technology, wild and domesticated, hunting and zookeeping, don't really stand up to scrutiny. They begin to shimmer and waver. Both images, in fact, are technical productions located in cinematic control rooms. Both are present objects of consumption to be captured by their images. Most interesting is the temporal inversion that the two images demand. The image that stands for the past in this pairing turns out to be much younger than the image that represents the future. The digital dinosaur is not, like the Paleolithic bison, an actually existing animal in a human present. It is a purely science fictional character, a living fleshly reanimation of an animal that lived on this planet long before the bisons or the primitive artists who painted their images. So in this sense, the futuristic animal, if not its image, is much more ancient than the animals of Lascaux. So perhaps the only contrast that really stands up between these images is the most literal natural fact about the objects represented in them. Lascaux is about herbivores, and Jurassic Park features its carnivores as the main attraction. The positions of predator and prey have been reversed. In the primitive image, it is we who hope to kill the wild object represented. In the contemporary futuristic image, the artificial object we have created has gone wild and threatens to kill us. So now I want to return to the question that I began with. Why should we take this odyssey or narrative or allegory seriously? Why should we think of the animal as central to the past, present, and future of the image? Why is it the best instance. The image as such, I think, no matter what the content of it, always engages temporality, either as the memory of a lost past to be recalled and represented, or as the perceived present of a real-time representation, such as a shadow, a reflection, dramatic performance, a live telecast, or as the imagination of a hoped-for or a dreaded future. So when we talk about the future of the image, we have to notice that we're conjuring with a double image, what I would call a meta picture. That is, an image of an image to come, an image of what hasn't yet arrived, but is on the horizon, like that rough beast that William Butler Yeats spied slouching toward Bethlehem. So in that sense, the future of the image is always now, in the latest and newest form of the image, whether it's the marvelous apparitions of Lascaux or the contemporary technological realization of the ancient dream of producing not just a lifelike image of a living thing, but an image which is both a copy, a reproduction, and itself a living thing. In other words, a living image of a life form. Now, before Jacques Rancière and I engaged in this dialogue, we went through a fairly long correspondence in which Rancière told me straight out that this was the aspect of my approach to images he found most troubling. He said it's a kind of vitalism, and he contrasted it to his own emphasis on artistic operations, and I'm quoting, operations that produce beings whose appeal relies precisely on the fact that they do nothing and want nothing. He called this a difference of sensibility, and no doubt it stems from a difference of formation. I was, as a boy, raised in the Catholic Church, was an altar boy, and was indoctrinated with the whole repertoire of animated images, from the poetics of the Eucharist to the icons and relics of saints. To the figure of the human body itself as the Imago Dei. I sense in Rancière's remark a deep suspicion about the notion of a life of images. And in fact, I share some of this skepticism, even as I try to indulge in its opposite, a kind of suspension of disbelief in the vitalist or animist accounts of the image. In my last book, What Do Pictures Want?, I suggested that one way of describing the ultimate goal of the labor of art on images might be to produce a picture that wanted nothing at all, producing a kind of aesthetic utopia beyond desire, a field of play, and to use Rancière's phrase for this, an emancipatory redistribution of the sensible. But I'm also interested in the idea of the suspicion of, or the skepticism about, a vitalist framework for thinking about images. And the closest I can come to a diagnosis of this is in the concluding pages of Rancière's essay, The Future of the Image, in his book by that title. In his survey of the images exhibited in our museums and galleries today, Rancière identifies three major categories. The first is what he calls the naked image, exemplified by Holocaust photographs and other images of abjection and atrocity, images which he says exclude the prestige of dissemblance associated with the labor of art. The labor of art is what takes images and makes them no longer resemble, makes them dissemble. But these images, the naked ones, can't be clothed by art. It would be obscene to aestheticize them and to work them over at least too much. And this is the kind of image which he says demands an ethical and political rather than an aesthetic response. They almost rule out looking at Holocaust photographs as aesthetic objects. A lot of people have said this, that there's something tasteless about it, if taste even has anything to do with it. The second category is what he calls the ostensive image, which insists on its power as sheer presence and employs aesthetic means to produce an effect modeled on that of the religious icon, That is, it faces us, it looks at us, it makes direct demands on us. The Byzantine icon would be probably the best example of this. And the third is what he calls the metaphoric image, which engages in critical play with the forms and products of imagery. That is, it cuts across the boundaries between artistic and non-artistic images in what he calls a double metamorphosis that makes meaningful images into opaque, stupid images, thus interrupting the media flow. And on the other hand, reviving dulled utilitarian objects so as to create the power of a shared history contained in them. The principal examples of the metaphoric image come from contemporary installation art and from the montage of Godard, especially his recent encyclopedic and poetic film, Histoire du Cinéma. Well, a couple of things strike me about Rancière's triad, his three ways of sealing or refusing the relationship between art and image. The first is, as he notes, that each of them encounters a point of undecidability that compels it to borrow something from the others. They can't be kept apart. Even the anti-artistic dehumanization presented by the naked image strays into the aesthetic because, as Rancière says, we see it with eyes. So I'm going to pass over our contemporary image of the... I think I've missed a page in here somewhere and skipped a whole section of this. It's all right. I'll fill it in later. Rancière wanted, he says, we see these images, the naked images, with eyes that have been, have already contemplated Rembrandt's skinned ox and equated the power of art with the obliteration of the boundaries between the human and the inhuman, the living and the dead, the animal and the mineral. The second thing that strikes one is that these results of the operations of art can hardly be said to produce objects that do nothing and want nothing. The language of power, desire, and vitalism runs throughout Rancière's own descriptions of these categories. The naked image refuses the separation of art and life. The obtuse brings its images to life in the manner of sacred icons, and the metaphoric produces what he calls metamorphoses. My best guess is that Rancière is citing this way of talking without, which is certainly common, without endorsing it. Indeed, if we pursued this question back into earlier periods of art history, we would find the language of life, if not of vitalism proper, everywhere. Rancière himself traces the genealogy of the modern ostensive image back to this figure, Manet's Dead Christ, with his eyes open, an image that causes the dead Christ to come back to life in the pure immanence of pictorial presence. And the discourse of ancient and early modern art is riddled with variations on this imperative to produce lifelike images. Perhaps then Rancière wants to see the labor of art on images as a way of calming or quieting their incorrigible tendency to take on lives of their own, to behave like viruses that spread and mutate faster than our immune systems can evolve to fight them off. An art that would produce beings whose appeal relies precisely on the fact that they do nothing and want nothing is perhaps a strategy that we have been calling demystification, a cure for the plague of images, a disenchantment of the fetishism of commodities, and the idolatry of the spectacle. And I just want to mention here a footnote from an essay by Judith Butler, a recent essay about Walter Benjamin, in which she argues that Benjamin, in an early 1919 essay, distinguishes the seductive living semblance, or what he calls the mythic sign, from the magical mark. And here's Butler's comment on it. To the extent that a work of art is living, it becomes semblance. But as semblance, it loses its status as a work of art, that is, for Benjamin. The task of the work of art, at least at this point in Benjamin's career, 1919-20, is precisely to break through this semblance, or indeed to petrify and still its life. Only through a certain violence against life is the work of art constituted, and so it is only through a certain violence that we might be able to see its organizing principle, and hence what is true about the work of art. This is from a recent collection called The Life and Death of Images from the Tate Gallery Publications in London. So it would be a concept of art, I think, this anti-vitalist tradition, which of course only makes sense if you understand that right along with it there is its counter-tradition, this notion that the whole point of art is to make something that has a life, that goes on, that has legs. Innumerable metaphors for talking about the successful artist as somebody who somehow brings a new life into the world. So this tradition, this counter-tradition, works not only against the vitalist and animist tendencies within aesthetic discourse, but would also we'll probably want to connect them to parallel narratives drawn from religion, magic, and science that conjure with the notion of a literally living image. I'm thinking of the whole tradition that, remember, God is the first sculptor. He makes Adam out of inert clay, breathes life into him, and then we know the rest of the story. Things go downhill from there. The Jewish golem, the invention of an artificial warrior, again, out of mud, who will defend Israel and who turns out to be more danger than he's worth. The Frankenstein myth, the robots and cyborgs of the 20th century. The 21st century version of the living image is the clone. That's what I passed over back there a few minutes ago, DALL-E, and then the cloned army of Star Wars, which is not merely the literalization of the living image, but its actual scientific realization, at least at the level of the animal so far. And this is another sense in which what is done with animals shows us the future of what will be done with people. The human clone has yet to make its appearance, except in novels and over 100 Hollywood movies since the early 1990s, and in ominous works of art like Paul McCarthy's The Clone, seen installed at the Hamburger Bahnhof in Berlin, which portrays the clone in what has become one of its canonical poses as the anonymous hooded figure of the organ donor. You notice that this one has already donated his arms. And this is a figure that runs throughout fictions, from Kazuo Ishiguro's Never Let Me Go to many other novels. The idea that that's what the human clone will be for, is to have a double who will provide spare parts for the original donor. And this is an image that's been in circulation at least since Jean Baudrillard's reflections on what he called the acephalic clone, the headless or faceless clone. And it reappears, I think, in a variety of guises. This is one of my favorites, Hans Hake's image, Stargazing, which he produced just before the 2004 elections as an image, I think, of the American citizen at that moment in history. I think perhaps, for me, I don't know how it was for you, but arguably the most depressing political moment in my life, the re-election of George W. Bush. And then this figure, the faceless hooded figure, appearing and reappearing in all kinds of mutations all over the world. This hooded, faceless figure, I think, has become the contemporary icon of facingness that Rancière associates with the contemporary obtuse image. And of course, it's also the naked image, as you know if you've studied the Abu Ghraib photographs. So if there's a common ground that Rancière and I are trying to locate, it's perhaps located in this ambivalence about the concept of the living image and the vitalist discourse of iconology and art history that goes with it. We both want to resist it, but I also want to explore it, seeing where it leads, following really the track opened up by Roland Barthes into the center of the labyrinth of images, a labyrinth which inevitably has some kind of beast at the center of it. The Minotaur, half man or half bull, seems always to be waiting there. So to do this, I think it entails a certain yielding to the spell of images, artistic or not. Rancière and I think, share an aversion to the fundamental assumption of iconoclasm that an image can be destroyed. In my view, it's extremely difficult and maybe impossible to either create or destroy an image. You can expose it, you can manipulate it, you can transform it, but the idea of getting rid of them, as Michael Taussig has pointed out many times, particularly in his book Defacement, the best way to pump a lot of life into an image is to try to kill it. An image is never so vital as at the moment when somebody tries to destroy it. So this, among other things, is why I think iconoclastic criticism, destructive criticism, wins repeated and easy victories over bad images. And I have argued that a better strategy with the bad image and with the good image is what Nietzsche recommended in his great preface to The Twilight of the Idols. He said, I want to attack the eternal idols, and I'm going to philosophize with a hammer, striking the idols and sounding them. And you have to notice, he says, I'm not going to smash them. He's not going to shatter them. He's going to sound them. And then he even changes the metaphor and says, forget the hammer, make that a tuning fork. I will strike the idols with a tuning fork. Now, exactly what that means in practice, what that would be as a guide to method, is something I'm trying to figure out. And, but it, to me, suggests a way forward for both criticism and perhaps, in some sense, for artistic practice. But I'll let you artists figure out what it would mean for you. Another region that Rancière and I have kind of mutually explored is the relation of words and images, verbal and visual art, or verbal and visual media for that matter. We clearly share a fascination with the relation of literature and the visual arts, but I think that we see the flow of influence and agency going in opposite directions. Rancière, my sense is, he regards literature, and especially his beloved realist novels of the 19th century, as producing the crucial new distribution of the sensible that makes it possible to see modern art, to see modern photography, and, in his view, determines all of the fundamental devices of film narrative. His remarks on media and the absolute independence of the image from medium specificity are, I think, calculated deliberately to outrage film theorists especially, and media theorists. He's said things like, it doesn't matter whether you watch Birth of a Nation, you know, the original print in the seventh row center in a film theater, or whether you watch it on your iPhone. Needless to say, all of the film scholars are outraged by this. But I think he makes a crucial point, that there is some sense in which Birth of a Nation is independent of the material support that it was originally encoded in. An image is a configuration or a convergence of what Foucault called the seeable and the sayable. The golden calf, for instance, sorry, that was back a ways. As you can see, these slides got jumbled. The golden calf appears in both text and image, circulating across the media of sculpture, painting, and verbal narrative. Every image is really then an image text, to use my phraseology, or a sentence image, as Rancière would put it. The question then is, which takes priority, and in what sense is it prior? For Rancière, it is definitely the word, for me, the image. For instance, Rancière believes that Dutch painting became visible in a new and modern way in the 19th century, that something became seeable in these paintings as a result of a new discourse, partly the realist novel, but also Hegel. My sense is that something was in the painting waiting to be described in a new way, waiting for language to catch up with a compelling picture. In that sense, the image, as always, goes before the word, foreshadowing the future if only we knew how to read it. And that's what makes images enigmatic insofar as they are devices for prediction. Images are the older sign, the archaic sign, or as Charles Sanders Peirce put it, the icons are the firstnesses. The index is second, the symbol is third. But the image comes first in perception and, of course, in the history of written signs. That's why I think images not only have a future related to technology and social change, but are the future, but seen through a glass darkly. But I want to wrap up here with a concrete example of a work of art that explores another area of common ground between our approaches, and that's the relation of aesthetics and politics. I had thought about offering up the following example. Mark Wallinger's installation entitled State Britain, a work that deliberately crosses the line, both literally and figuratively, between art and politics. Wallinger and his collective fabricated replicas of the propaganda posters that had been removed from Parliament Square a couple of years ago as a result of a new law prohibiting political demonstrations within a 1-mile radius of Parliament. If you think that the American Constitution has suffered in the last 7 years, you should see what the British Constitution has gone through. It's even worse. Wallinger, an activist named Brian Haw, has been living in Parliament Square for the last 6 years, doing a one-man live-in protest against the war in Iraq and other military adventures that Britain has gone into alongside of the U.S. So Parliament passed a law prohibiting demonstrations within a mile of the Houses of Parliament. And so Wallinger had all of these pieces copied. These are not the originals. The originals were all destroyed by the police when they removed them. And this is a picture basically of the forbidden zone, prohibiting any kind of political symbolism or protest in that mile circumference around the Houses of Parliament. Now, if you look closely at this map, you'll see that at the southern end of the circle, where it crosses the Thames, that's exactly where the Tate Britain is. The line goes down the center of the Great Hall of the Tate Britain. So Wallinger took the protest. Here he is sitting in front of this work of art, and you can see the line on the floor. Now, what's the effect of this work of art? What does it mean? Well, insofar as I'm a kind of incurable vitalist about art, it's to me a deeply disturbing and melancholy piece. The removal of the images from their proper location, from their political location in Parliament Square to the Tate Britain does have what Rancière describes as the proper aesthetic effect. That is, in a way, it anesthetizes the images, takes them away from the location where they were supposed to live, and casts them into a kind of trance or cryogenic sleep. And if you imagined a film about a British future in which this image were to be portrayed, you would imagine a future which is actually now, a future in which the most vulgar, straightforward kind of protest art, the only place left for it would be as a relic in a museum. People would come in and they'd say, yes, that's the way political art used to look. We remember what agitprop was. There it is. So it's as if the Tate Britain becomes a kind of mausoleum for the forlorn relics of British liberty. I mean, I'm not saying this to criticize negatively Wallinger's work. I think it's actually a brilliant piece of work, but that doesn't keep it from having this kind of melancholia about it. In fact, I think that's constitutive of its greatness. But here's another. This is a more, I think, lighthearted and perhaps ephemeral living image. It's a recent work of art at the Tate Modern by Tania Bruguera, a Cuban artist that brought two mounted policemen onto the bridge across the turbine hall in the Tate, where the mounted policemen then proceeded to herd the audience about, demonstrating their crowd control techniques. Now, you might ask, well, why do I call this an image when the artist declares explicitly her intention was to resist the image as a distancing operation, a separation of the viewer from what is beheld. You know, typically when you see police herding crowds around, you're seeing it on television, not immersed in it. But I think what Bruguera does is produce an awakening and enlivening of an image that has been anesthetized in its media circulation by being dislocated from real life to television. She's put it into a place between television and real life, that is, a place like the museum, the Tate Modern, the space of the regime of what Rancière calls the aesthetic image. Now, although Bruguera wanted the audience not to know that this was art, there was no announcement, an artistic performance is beginning. People knew that something was going to happen, but they didn't know what. She knew that people had to know that in some sense this was in the place of art, and so they were prepared to see this not as a serious police action, but as an artistic event. They understood it as a picture, a representation, but one they had entered as an environment, a very temporary environment. And so if you look in the background, you see that people are already taking pictures. Now, as with the Wallinger piece, I think it's difficult to specify the precise effect. It shares with the Tate Britain a staging of the encounter between police power and the primal source of the authentically political, namely the gathering of people who may or may not resist the power that controls their lives. Neither Wallinger nor Bruguera are engaged in what might be called directly political protest art or agitprop. They are instead removing that kind of art and action to a space more designed for contemplation. They could be interpreted then as engaged in mourning for a time of revolutionary resistance and dissent that's just no longer available, or in redistributing our sense of where the proper boundaries of art and life, aesthetics and politics are located. The title of Tania's piece is Tatlin Whisper, which I think tells you something about the tonality. It's a subdued sotto voce echo of revolutionary monumentalism. So the aesthetic regime, and I'm using Rancière's phrase there, is now a shelter for an endangered, vanishing sense of the political, and perhaps a petri dish for nurturing it back to life. The Tate Britain, although a state-sponsored museum, is hospitable to refugee images from their proper home in Parliament Square, and the mounted police were benign and well-behaved in the Tate Modern. The horses very well trained, good shepherds to the sheep they were herding. This may not be directly political or revolutionary art, but rather, to use Bruguera's phrase, useful art. Useful for making one of the most common images of public space today available to experience in a new way. It's also an image of an increasingly probable future in social spaces marked not by fixed or legislated police lines, police boundaries, but by flexible, animated boundaries. I'm thinking here, for instance, of the flying checkpoints phrase that's used all over the countryside of the occupied Palestinian territories. So the legally instituted boundary, the mobile police improvised boundary, is one future of the image already open, already upon us. Now, this paper should really just end right there, but I have a coda which seemed to me necessary to add at the present moment in any thinking about the future of the image, and especially its political future. It would seem strange not to mention the emergence of a new political and cultural icon that has marked the emergence of a new political epoch in our moment, in this very moment, signaling the close, one hopes, not just of a political administration, but perhaps the whole age of terror and the war on terror that has dominated the world for the last 8 years. And I'm here, you know what I'm talking about. I'm thinking of Barack Obama and the remarkable iconography that has evolved around his face, his body, and even his family. Just days after his election, this poster is by an artist named Richard Ferry, and millions, literally millions of these have been circulated worldwide in poster form, on T-shirts, so forth. In the days immediately following Obama's election, this image was coupled immediately by the right-wing bloggers with this image. And I think you can see that from an art historical standpoint, they're not totally wrong. It actually, color scheme, iconography, the kind of technique of shadowing the face, very similar. This appeared within 1 week of the election, and with a blog by Peggy Shapiro in an online magazine called The American Thinker. And the point is obvious: to reinforce what had been a theme of the campaign, Obama as a socialist, maybe even horrors, a communist. But I doubt very much that this guilt by association is going to work now, any better than did the attempts to link Obama with the so-called terrorist William Ayers. It'll be overwhelmed, I think, at least for the time being, by images like the cover of Time magazine, which I hope you've all seen, which photoshops Obama into the famous iconography of FDR riding in the back of a convertible on Inauguration Day. The historical comparison with FDR's image will, I think, have more legs than the Lenin poster, if only for the prosaic reason that Obama has just taken power in a democratic election, not a violent revolution or military coup, and has done so at the moment of the worst financial crisis since the Great Depression. In contrast to George W. Bush, who exploited the national tragedy of 9/11 to fuel fear itself and the declaration of a state of endless war on an indefinite amorphous phenomenon known as terror, as the justification for an endless state of emergency and unprecedented executive powers. In contrast to that, Obama has taken power with a message of hope and the unambiguous support of the voters. Bush's most famous effort to enhance his image, you may recall, is this one, which was an image that was immediately cloned in the following animated image, an action figure, quite literally, suitable for 12-year-olds and older. But another reason, I think, that the guilt by association strategy, the attempt to link Obama's image with terror, with communism, and so forth, the reason it won't work is because the public has recently been immunized to this sort of image tactic, and especially over the year-long war of images that punctuated every stage of the presidential campaign. One notable moment of immunization was back in July, when the New Yorker released the following cover, which I'm sure you all saw. It was the subject of innumerable blogs, portraying Obama as a Muslim and Michelle as a kind of Angela Davis revolutionary. Now, I wonder, maybe we should take a poll here. I know just about all of my leftist friends were horrified by this image and said they've really gone too far. The New Yorker really sucks. And for some strange reason, maybe if Obama had lost, I might be wailing and eating crow. But since he won, I want to say that at the time, I told everybody, this is a welcome image. It is a kind of immunization, a measured dose of the image viruses that were circulating in the media sphere at that time, but didn't dare to show their face directly. It had the effect of rendering visible and manifestly ridiculous the sly innuendos of right-wing propaganda. Some images, like Bush as a jet pilot, gain their power by only being half visible and easily disavowed, avoiding direct manifestation. And the fact that Bush did dress up in jet pilot drag really exposed him to, as you've seen, direct ridicule. To me, it was clear that the joke in this image was not on the Obamas, but on the idiots who believe in this sort of slander. And, I think even more important, on the left-wing critics who think that most American citizens are idiots who cannot be trusted to discern irony and satire. I know everybody said, well, this is just typical of the New Yorker and their sophisticated, elitist attitudes. Don't they realize that everyone out there, the other side of the Hudson, they'll all take this seriously. They'll think it's, they won't see the joke. But I think they did, or they felt it. And they knew that the joke was aimed not at them, not at the Obamas, but at things like Fox News and their coy speculations about whether the terrorist fist pump, remember, exchanged by Michelle and Barack on winning his nomination, that kind of phrase was being exposed and theatricalized. I also suspect that the New Yorker was quite aware that its intentions would be misconstrued and that it would outrage its own liberal, politically correct, sophisticated readers. In effect, the New Yorker offered itself up as a substitute victim for the Obamas by making its own elitist Knickerbocker avatar into a punching bag for its own readers. And the cartoonist for The Nation magazine immediately saw this in this riff. The New Yorker foresaw the future of its own image, inviting and welcoming its consummation in the fires of laughter. One cannot say the same thing about the evolutionary mutation of Bush's mission accomplished photo op, which quickly degenerated into an image of puerile phoniness that has haunted his presidency right down to its ignominious conclusion. And that is my conclusion for today. Thank you.
Thank you, Tom. Great talk as ever. I have a comment and I have a question. The comment would be to do with Tate Britain, which is, as you know, actually, I think the way that you described the site was really interesting.
The way I described what?
The space, the physical space.
Yeah.
But it's also, of course, the space from which people were deported to Australia in the late 18th century, and it was then the site of Millbank Prison, and it is now a structure built by the sugar baron Tate, who was, and has a long and corrupt history behind him. So there's no particular melancholy that's new to that space in a certain sense. It's always been a melancholy space. That leads me to ask you about your first pair of images, which seem to sort of bracket that whole bare life, political life discussion into a different space, in the sense that the Lascaux image clearly precedes any possibility of that division. And in a certain sense, the Jurassic Park anticipates a future in which there is also in a sense, it's not possible to divide life into a different space, in the sense that the Lascaux image clearly precedes any possibility of that division. And in a certain sense, the Jurassic Park anticipates a future in which there is also in a sense, it's not possible to divide life in that simple way. Mm-hmm. And I wondered if it's that that question seemed to resonate through your presentation about the place of life in the image, that what modalities of life we want to attribute to the image. If you want to subscribe to Agamben's distinction, or if you feel that the life that's attributable to the image is in some sense different to that political and bare life distinction that's been so resonant over the past several years.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that the life of images admits of as many gradations as the life of actual biological entities. You know, all the way from the most elementary. This is why I think the concept of the viral, the image as a kind of infectious organism that gets into our system, circulates in consciousness. The idea that you cannot forget them, you can't expel them once they've gotten into you. So, and that many of them are like resident aliens inside of you. All those analogies for images start really at well below the threshold of Agamben's bare life, which is bare human life, the reduction of human beings to, say, the level of vermin or cockroaches in the concentration camps. Images have always been, in my view, seen as a parallel universe to the real, to the actual, which imitate that life and in all of its gradations and refinements. Whether this, and so I don't think what I'm arguing suddenly redistributes any distinctions between art and life. It simply provides a different terrain for thinking about how we use the language of life to talk about these objects that we make and the pictures we show ourselves. Am I actually addressing your question, Nick, or am I just evading it? Say more.
I would never accuse you of evading it. Yeah. And I was thinking at the end, though, when you talked about the Obama image as inoculate, the New Yorker image as an inoculation, then that suggests that there is a kind of interface, at least, that if it's acting as an antiviral agent, that then there must be some form of stream, bloodstream, image stream, or whatever one wants to call it, in which the image circulates and other images can act upon it, which is a very interesting metaphor. And so that, I mean, I don't have a neat solution to it. I don't think there is one. I'm just curious where you're going with that.
Well, I think it's you know, one of the operations on images that is very important is something like the immunization process, in which you take the toxic image but administer a certain calibrated dose of it in a certain kind of reframing, which is very difficult to specify. I mean, I couldn't generalize about what this would be. All I know is that I thought the New Yorker cover successfully did that, that it was a brilliant moment of showing what was being insinuated but could not show its face directly. I mean, nobody would have taken it seriously if anybody had said this. And so I complimented the New Yorker on it. I thought that it was the right thing to do at that moment. Risky. It could have, you know, if it hadn't been for our blessed financial crisis, who knows what would have happened in this election. But that image also was playing a role. It was certainly McCain and his henchmen thought that the figures, but the shadowy, kind of invisible figures, the insinuated figure of Barack Hussein Obama, and you know, the transformation of Michelle into a figure of a revolutionary, and the transformation of this familiar gesture into the terrorist fist pump. I think that was Hanratty on Fox News. All those little insinuations were actually conjuring an image that didn't quite dare to show its face directly. So to me, that's one of the things that image immunization is about. Yeah. Preemptive humor, yeah, that would be a reasonable phrase. Yes?
If this is a New Yorker when you're talking about some anonymous New Yorker writer or Clear that it was a sharp left jab in the face of Fox News and all that. I'm just curious about that, because that would be an image.
This is one case where I think, I mean, I'd be happy to hear other opinions on this, but it seemed to me that it absolutely had to be done by an image, because part of it was to take something that was being insinuated, that didn't show its face directly, and to manifest it. As my patron poet William Blake said, one of the roles of art is to give error a body, to show the illusion, to manifest it. And I think Haka's image of the stargazer does something similar. It gives a body, gives a face, in this case a faceless face, to a kind of symptomatic condition. It was echoed almost immediately after the 2004 election by Der Spiegel, which showed the Statue of Liberty with an American flag blindfold, and the caption under it, Augen zu und durch, eyes shut and plunge forward. And it was as if, I have no idea whether the cover designer for Der Spiegel was aware of Haka's image, but there it was. I mean, it was like the image had mutated into what forecast the result of the election to what then assessed it and made visible what had happened. There's one up in the back.
Thanks very much for your illuminating talk, especially the length of time from the archaic image of Lascaux to this very contemporary image, which of course is the latest one, not the Spielberg. But I want to ask something that goes very much to the heart of your work, which you discussed, throughout, not just here, and the philosophical question of the relation of the verbal language to the visual. Here you're suggesting through your vitalism a primacy of the visual, but almost all of your images, especially this one here, are overlaid with both verbal iconography and language, as well as clearly historical and textual framing, which fundamentally informs your interpretation of them. And I would also say that, especially true, of course, of the Spielberg image, which is actually a numeric verbal realization, so that you're seeing the words and the images at the same time. And for me also, certainly with the cave paintings in the archaic, which could be understood as a kind of early realization of writing. The cave paintings are just as much writing. I mean, you isolate one images of the bison, but in the caves there are images of thousands of years apart. There are many aspects which are not primarily images, but seem other kinds of, many of them are simply markings, including the handprints that overlay. So I just ask you to rehearse again this argument, which wouldn't surprise you, that troubles me, about this issue of primacy, rather than interdependence, or perhaps a more Wittgensteinian sense that we live in a world which is in which the verbal and the historical is our membrane for visual perception, that there isn't a visual perception that's independent.
It's excellent question. I could go on for a very long time in answering it. I think the circumstance of this particular paper drove me into a kind of oversimplification of the question of priority. Of course, every image is, as I've argued, an image text. They always come laden with language. And that's even true when the whole purpose of the image is to somehow evacuate language, to produce pure presence, to produce something about which nothing can be said. It simply is there. But of course, immediately something is said, something beyond what is there. So I was driven into this actually by the contrast with Rancière, because he's very emphatic about the priority of literature, that the idea that narrative cinema it depends upon the conventions of the 19th century realist novel, or even more emphatically that you, in a certain sense, you couldn't see Dutch painting, in his view, until you had the language, the right language to see it. And maybe that's the example I would want to press on. I would say, I'm sure people did see Dutch painting, and they talked about it, and they had lots of categories of appreciation and interpretation. But they also had, and I think this is foundational to the phenomenon of Dutch painting, they were tired of readable pictures, pictures which had allegories, history, religious texts that were clearly legible in them. And they wanted pictures that you could relax the urge to verbalize and to allegorize and turn into emblems or symbols. So it was a reduction of the symbolic. At the same time, many of the Dutch paintings were simply scenes of modern life. This is the way we live. This is our land. This is our space. And we want to double it, as if they were reinforcing the sense that the Dutch were creating a land out of the sea. And it was enough to see it and not to have to allegorize it. So that's, I think the question is, what kind of language? What is the genre of words that seems appropriate? With the Caves of Lascaux, of course, it's all speculation. But we surely, as a matter of a kind of foundational principle, we know that they were talking or singing or reciting and probably doing some writing as well, as you point out. In the same caves there are petroglyphs, most of them completely unreadable, but we know they were to be read. So that's another part of the image and its temporality, that sometimes it's not just the image is there but cannot be read yet, or we don't know what the right code is, but also it can be a case where the code is forgotten. And all we can see is this naked image and make up stories about it. Over here.
I wanted to ask about the two pieces that you showed from the Tate. I thought they were both great pieces, but also very melancholic. I thought both of them were. Something about the domestication of politics in that case, what you were talking about. I wonder if you would comment on two recent images that undomesticate politics. One is Greece, right? The protests in Greece that are going on right now, if you didn't hear about it, or WTO in Seattle, and the protest, the sit-in in Chicago. Just what I'm talking about is these non-art gestures that are political as images. You see what I'm saying?
Yeah, I don't know about the protests in Greece right now, so I can't really comment on those.
I guess just real-life protest as opposed to domesticated museum protest. Not to minimize the political action of the artists, but do you see that it's an image?
Yeah.
That,
Well, I think. Let me just mention another case by way of trying to formulate an answer. About 4 years ago, a documentary film that won the grand prize at Karlsruhe ZKM Festival of New Media turned out it was a documentary about the state of public space and political protest in public space at the present time. And it focused especially on the techniques that the Austrian police have developed, which are now being replicated by police forces everywhere. And that's to cloister or segregate protest or public demonstrations. So if you want to demonstrate at a political convention or in a public space, first, permission is required. If you look at, I'll show you a couple of supplementary images here. This is the Serious Organized Crime and Police Act, 2005. This is the Act of Parliament, and this is the Clause 133A and B, which I think are particularly sinister. Notice especially Clause B here. If the demonstration is to be carried on by a person by himself, by that person, it is also prohibited. So in principle, if you wear a T-shirt with a caricature of Tony Blair on it, if you did it when Blair was still Prime Minister, you would have been and you didn't get permission from the police to wear that T-shirt within a mile of Parliament Square, you would have been in violation of this act. So the idea of public space and access to public space for something like political art, that is performance, demonstrations, manifestations of verbal and visual signs as part of a political discourse, that is now sequestered. In that sense, I think Bruguera and Wallinger, by moving the agitprop into the museum, they're also, it's an allegory of this very real fact about our time, that there is, public space is becoming increasingly rare. The space where an authentically political event, a gathering, can occur is being more and more sequestered. The Austrian police developed the idea that if you have a mass gathering in a public square, the first thing to do is don't try to break it up, confine it, produce a plastic fence all around it so that people can neither enter nor leave without going through a checkpoint and being identified, photographed, fingerprinted. And then they have to ask permission, for instance, to go to the bathroom. So this is what has happened to political space, and I think clever artists like Wallinger and Bruguera are showing us that, but using the aesthetic space as a place to make it visible. So it's I think this is another reason why, people ask, why did Obama draw such huge crowds? I think it's because he was a catalyst for the only authentically political moment that I have witnessed in quite a long time. It was all this stored up need for people simply to gather. The inauguration itself already, as you know, people are renting out their apartments for $10,000 a week because millions of people are going to show up for the inauguration. And I think it's because it's been the confinement of the gathering, the prevention of the gathering, of the political assembly, that he became the catalyst for the rejuvenation of that possibility. Yeah, question here. There's a microphone coming down to you.
Do you think that there's any kind of mitigation of that restriction of public space by the fact that there's this new kind of public space, which is, sort of cyberspace?
Yes, I think that's a very good point. That in a sense, I think it's quite significant that Obama is not just the first black president, he's the first wired president. Yeah, exactly. And used the internet in a way that was really quite unprecedented. The idea of in Denver of having everyone get on the cell phone and send a text message to somebody. He really had a brilliant grasp of that new space for public gathering, but it also manifested itself in real space in these incredible rallies.
But it's also symbolically, he's not just a black president. He's a biracial president that has an Asian sister and grew up kind of everywhere.
And I'm determined, by the way, to, in this kind of euphoric honeymoon between his election and his inauguration, to live it up. Because there'll be plenty to be depressed about after he's inaugurated.
I'm a little bit curious about the possibility for interchange between or exchange between sort of the pictorial, sort of imagined image space and the concept of a real space, where it seems like a lot of, especially nonviolent protests, sort of are really images being enacted in the public space and vice versa. I'm wondering if you can sort of talk about that dialogue there.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the mass gathering in general is meant to show force of numbers, the power of the multitude or the crowd, but in principle a nonviolent force, a nonviolent power, which can't be dispersed without producing an incredibly powerful image of the attempt to destroy an image. So, I mean, to me, the most canonical example of what you're talking about is what I would call the performance art of Martin Luther King, in which he made Bull Connor an extra, and the police with their dogs and fire hoses. They became part of a manifestation, a graphic televisual manifestation of actual politics in action. So, yeah, in this case, the real and the imaginary, or the real and the represented, they definitely bleed into one another, and that's why so much of politics is theater, and it is the manufacturing of images, sometimes really bad images, like Bush's jet pilot iconography. I mean, that wasn't some kind of accident. They intended that. But one thing they found out, as we all do, that you never know. You can't control an image. Sometimes you produce one and it has the wrong kind of legs. That one walked away from the scene as an action figure, a ridiculous caricature. Yeah.
I was curious about the trajectory of how you would see the trajectory of the Charles Moore image of protesters, civil rights protesters in Birmingham, and the police sending the dogs after them, and that picture having been sort of co-opted by Warhol, and then I think more lately by Kelly Walker. Mm-hmm. And it seems to me it's got at least like 3 or 4 different lives.
Yeah.
And I think the first one is maybe the most naked, if that's the model one's going to use. And what could you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, it's a great question, but I don't know if I really have a very interesting answer for you. I think every once in a while a political performance produces an image which is indelible, which really becomes canonical, and then in turn becomes a subject for recycling, for new situations. I really don't know what to say about Warhol, but here's another one which I think I can say something about. That's Guernica. Probably the greatest piece of agitprop ever produced, but also a great work of art. And it travels and traveled everywhere. And its most notable moment in our recent history was when, I can't remember whether it was a copy or the original hanging in the United Nations, when Colin Powell made his visit to make the speech which justified the invasion of Iraq. And the U.S. State Department insisted that the picture be covered up while he was there, which to me, the moment when you have to cover up a picture, that's the moment when it's really alive, really dangerous, almost as much as the defacing or destroying it, to use Tausig's principle.